Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, August 15th, 2023. All right, first thing I want to mention today is that it is fundraising season again at antiwar.com, and we launched this fundraiser on Monday. And, this is how we get by. We are an entirely reader-funded operation. That's how we're able to bring you our, unique news coverage and all the opinion pieces that we publish, of course, from our, anti-war, non-interventionist point of view. The only way we can do this is by being entirely independent and relying on the people that read antiwar.com and now the people that listen to this show to get by. We're an extremely small staff. Your donations go directly to running the website. So if you go to antiwar.com/donate, you can see the different ways you could help us out. You can make a one-time donation using a credit card, PayPal, or crypto. Special donations, set up a monthly donation, which a lot of people do. They give to us every month, and we appreciate all the support that we get. So if you could help us out, please go to antiwar.com/donate. Tell your friends about it. Help us get this thing off to a quick start so we could focus on bringing you the news and the coverage that we do. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, a new arms package for Ukraine uses accounting error funds. So the Biden administration on Monday announced a $200 million arms package for Ukraine using funds made available by a Pentagon accounting error that includes munitions for Patriot air defense systems, the HIMARS rocket systems, and other equipment. So if you remember back in June, the Pentagon came out and they claimed that they were overvaluing weapons that they sent to Ukraine through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to give Ukraine weapons directly from U.S. military stockpiles. So they claimed that they used the number that it would cost to buy the weapons brand new. And then adjusting to the new number, it freed up $6.2 billion. So a huge amount of money that they now say they can use to send more weapons to Ukraine. So, no matter what, they're going to find the money to keep this proxy war going. And this is the first time that they are dipping into this, found money that they have now. So the arms package announced Monday, the Pentagon said, quote, "This security assistance package will utilize assistance previously authorized under PDA for Ukraine that remained after the PDA reevaluation process concluded in June," end quote. So this arms package includes the Patriot munitions, HIMARS ammunition, mine-clearing equipment and systems, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, tank ammunition, TOW missiles, Javelin, and other anti-tank systems and rockets, 37 tactical vehicles to tow and haul equipment, 58 water trailers, over 12 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, demolition mines, and spare parts maintenance and other field equipment. So the Pentagon also released a fact sheet on Monday that said the U.S. has pledged over $43 billion in military equipment for Ukraine since Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022. So $43 billion. So once they use up this $6 billion, that's pushing $50 billion. And again, this is just in military equipment alone. And, what we know about what they're telling us about. The other spending includes money for the Pentagon to replenish these stockpiles, troop deployments, economic aid, and all that. And so this new arms package came after the White House asked Congress to authorize an additional $24 billion in spending on the war, and that includes another $13 billion in military aid. And that's probably divided between the presidential drawdown and then the other ways that they're arming Ukraine, the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the U.S. to buy weapons for Ukraine. So there's different ways that they're giving them weapons. But just more money, more spending. Even though this counteroffensive is clearly not going well, there's no sign that they're going to back down. They're just going to keep fueling this thing. All right, the next one here. John Bolton blasts Biden for Ukraine's failing counteroffensive. So I thought this was interesting to see, the Hawks perspective, the ultra Hawk perspective. So former National Security Advisor John Bolton has blasted President Biden over Ukraine's stalling counteroffensive in an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal that was published on Sunday. So for those who don't know, Bolton, notoriously hawkish, he was Trump's national security advisor for about a year. He was really responsible for sabotaging diplomacy with North Korea. He's a big Iran, regime change advocate. And, he was he was one of the architects of the Iraq War, just really the worst of the worst. And, an unrepentant hawk. He has no qualms about advocating for war and destruction, on a huge scale. So while Ukraine has received tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons from the U.S., and that's a scale of aid that has not been seen since the post-World War II Marshall Plan. That's the only thing to compare it to, which was the U.S. aid to rebuild Europe after World War II. So Bolton said, despite all that Biden was not doing enough, and he blamed the president's hesitancy for Ukraine's inability to break through Russia's defenses. And that's a criticism we've seen from some Republicans in Congress. McCall, the head of the House Armed Services Committee, or he's the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, he said this, Biden's not doing enough. That's their criticism, which is really amazing. So Bolton wrote, quote, Ukraine's offensive failures and Russia's defensive successes share a common cause, the slow, faltering, non-strategic supply of military assistance by the West, end quote. So Bolton said that the administration was too concerned about the risk of escalation. He wrote, quote, the serial debate over whether to supply this or that weapon system, the perpetual fear that Russia will escalate the war against NATO, and occasional Kremlin nuclear saber rattling have instilled a paralyzing caution in Western capitals, end quote. And we know, for following this thing, that the U.S. is caring less and less about the concerns about escalation. They're sending tanks. They signed off on sending the F-16s, all sorts of huge escalations, things that we wouldn't think would have ever happened, a few years ago. So Bolton described Biden's fueling of the proxy war in Ukraine as timid and haphazard, and he blamed the president for the growing public opposition to the policy. A recent CNN poll found that 55% of Americans are opposed to additional spending on the war. He also criticized the administration's sanctions policy, arguing that they were not being properly enforced. He also called for the U.S. to start sanctioning China over its relationship with Russia. And the U.S. has been sanctioning China, but specifically over its partnership with Russia. And, he sounded like the more hawkish members of the Biden administration, like Secretary of State Antony Blinken, because he said there should not be a ceasefire, no negotiations, let's keep going. And, that basically is the Biden administration line. So, again, I just thought it was interesting to see someone complaining that Biden's not doing enough when, he's been doing so much and so involved in this war. All right, the next one here. Ukraine seeks more mine-clearing equipment as sappers take a huge loss. This article is from Kyle Anzalone. He wrote it on Sunday. He did a lot of writing for me when I took my day off. The Ukrainian military has struggled to work through Russia's heavily mined defensive lines as its counteroffensive has dragged on for 10 weeks with little to nothing to show for it. Kiev is now appealing to its allies for more demining equipment. Ukrainians assigned to be deminers, known as Sappers, have taken heavy losses in the counteroffensive. So the Guardian spoke with a Ukrainian sapper. He was basically just describing how they're suffering huge casualties, and he has to take painkillers. He has to shoot himself up with painkillers every day just to keep fighting. That's how rough a shape he's in. I can't imagine what these people are dealing with and what they're going through, crawling through these mines. The Wall Street Journal recently quoted a Ukrainian soldier who said that they're using bodies to demine these fields. So that means a lot of people are getting blown up. So it's really horrific. And because of that, Ukraine is trying to get more mine clearing equipment. But they still, have not gotten through these minefields. All right, the next one here is another one from Kyle. Stephen Moore works to keep Republicans in line on Ukraine. So this is a guy named Stephen Moore. He's a former congressional staffer and the head of the Ukraine Freedom Project. He is working to keep Republican legislatures committed to providing billions in arms and financial assistance to Kiev. Moore's task is becoming more challenging as Americans turn against providing Ukraine with an endless supply of weapons and dollars. So he's basically portrayed as the Republicans, the GOP's guy in Ukraine, and he says that he sees it as his role to prevent Republican lawmakers from being influenced by their war-weary constituents, because, as again, opposition to this policy is growing. And he has cultivated a vast network of government officials, NGOs, and engaged people in Ukraine and Washington. His work gives him the kind of first-hand, on-the-ground insight into the conflict that can be very persuasive on his frequent trips to the U.S. Capitol. Republican politicos consider him one of the most powerful behind-the-scenes advocates for Ukraine. One argument that he deploys when speaking with Republican legislatures is claiming the money the U.S. is spending in Ukraine has been effective in dismantling the Russian military. He said, quote, "If you're a fiscal conservative, you know this is a great use of taxpayer dollars and not one single American soldier has had to die," end quote. So, if you're a fiscal conservative, apparently you favor spending over $100 billion on a proxy war that risks nuclear war, according to this guy. But that is the attitude. Americans aren't dying. Ukrainians are dying. That doesn't matter to them. So that is the argument that he's going with. All right, the next one here. China warns strong measures as Taiwan's vice president is in the U.S. So China on Sunday vowed that it would take strong measures as Taiwanese Vice President Lai Ching-te stopped in the U.S. on his way to Paraguay, which is one of the few nations that has diplomatic relations with Taipei. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry said in a statement, quote, "The U.S. and the Taiwan authorities arranged for Lai to engage in political activities in the U.S. in the name of having a stopover. This seriously violates the One China principle, gravely undermines China's sovereignty and territorial integrity," end quote. So he stopped in New York on his way to Paraguay and will stop in San Francisco when he travels back to Taiwan. The U.S. and Taiwan have defended the travel plan, saying that there's precedent for Taiwanese officials to stop in the U.S., but, things are very different now. Tensions are very high. U.S.-China relations are very low, and it's largely due to this new support that the U.S. has been providing Taiwan, kind of building the relationship. And the trip is more sensitive for Beijing because Lai is the presidential candidate for Taiwan's ruling independence-minded Democratic Progressive Party, and he's leading the polls for the 2024 election. He's the front runner to win. And I just linked to the polls in Wikipedia here, and if you go down and check it out, he's pretty far ahead of the opposition, the Kuomintang and the TPP, which is the Taiwan's People's Party. They're polling much better than people thought. They thought it would be a tight race between the DPP and the Kuomintang, but now you have the TPP here. So there's a chance that if they combine forces, the KMT and the TPP, they might be able to beat Lai. But right now, as it is, it looks like he's got a pretty good shot at winning, which China's not going to be happy about. So anyway, where was I here? So the Chinese Foreign Ministry, they went after Lai a bit. They said that he clings to the separatist position for Taiwan independence, and they called him a troublemaker. So if you remember earlier this year, Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, met with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California on her way back to Taiwan. Again, it was one of these stopover trips, and that provoked major Chinese military drills. And those talks between Tsai and McCarthy, that marked the highest level meeting between U.S. and Taiwanese officials inside the U.S. since Washington severed diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979. So that was significant. Right now, there's no sign that Lai is going to meet with any high-level U.S. officials. There's some House Republicans told Kamala Harris that she should meet him. But again, there's no sign that that's happening. Who knows? There could be some sort of surprise meeting maybe on his way back when he goes to California, but I doubt it would be with the vice president. So he delivered a speech in New York on Monday, and he took a defiant tone in the face of all this pressure from Beijing. So things are going to heat up, I think, as this election gets closer with him. All right. And I saw that there was some Chinese military activity around Taiwan, planes crossing the median line. That's become pretty normal now since Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last year. Maybe we'll see some bigger drills in response to Lai being in the U.S. So I just want to take this moment to mention our sponsor for today's show, which is the Expat Money Summit. So if you go to expatmoneysummit.com, you could reserve your free ticket to this summit that is being hosted by Mikkel Thorup of Expat Money. And his work focuses on getting people set up, providing people with resources if they're thinking about moving out of the country, or if they're thinking about a plan B, getting a type of residence in another country, especially in the era of the digital nomad. It's something I've always thought about since I started working for antiwar.com full time. Especially if I was, single and didn't have a family like I do now, the idea of traveling around and working on my laptop is, pretty appealing. So this event is taking place from October 2nd to October 6th. So go to expatmoneysummit.com to register. And there's going to be a lot of big speakers: Peter Schiff, Mark Faber, Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Jim Rogers, Tom Woods is going to be speaking, and a lot of other experts in the field. And they're going to discuss things like residencies and citizenships, wealth protection and tax planning so you don't have to fund wars, investing and diversification, and the expat lifestyle, and just a lot more. It's really the only summit event of its kind. And again, in general, what Mikkel does is a great resource for those who live abroad or want to, or want to get started. That's really what he focuses on. And he's a supporter of this show. So go check it out, expatmoneysummit.com. All right, let's get back into the news here. The next one, Biden to strengthen alliance with South Korea and Japan at Camp David. So President Biden will spend his first ever Camp David summit working to form a new trilateral alliance between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea as part of his strategy against China in the Asia Pacific. Biden has invited Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol to meet him at Camp David this Friday, which will mark the first trilateral summit between the three nations outside of other international events. So the first time outside, they've held meetings, on the sidelines of, other summits, but this is the first trilateral Japan, South Korea at Camp David. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism there. And the U.S. has been encouraging Japan and South Korea to reconcile their relationship, which has been strained for many decades, mainly due to Imperial Japan's treatment of Koreans when they occupied Korea. You all hear these horrific stories about the comfort women that they had. So a lot of animosity, but the U.S. and things have been happening pretty quickly. We're going to see some new cooperation between them. The U.S. views both countries as key partners in the buildup aimed at China in the region. And maybe key partners wasn't the best way for me to phrase that. There's a huge U.S. military presence in both countries. There are treaty allies of the U.S., so, the U.S. wants them to be in on, whatever future war is going to happen in the region. And at Camp David, the three nations are expected to announce joint military exercises, a crisis hotline, and plans to hold an annual trilateral summit. So this is something they're going to do every year. And according to Nikkei Asia, they are also expected to discuss progress made on a plan to share intelligence on North Korean missile launches as tensions have been soaring on the Korean peninsula. A U.S. official told Nikkei Asia, quote, "The leaders will celebrate a new chapter in their trilateral relationship as they reaffirm their strong bonds of friendship and the ironclad alliances between the United States and Japan and the United States and the Republic of Korea," end quote. So this summit, tensions are still very high on the Korean peninsula, of course. This comes after the U.S. docked a nuclear-armed submarine in South Korea for the first time in 1981. Huge provocation, just for the sake of provocation, aimed at North Korea. But it's also likely meant as a message to China. I think a lot of this is about China. The U.S. sending all these bombers and submarines to South Korea. Two provocations for the price of one is probably how they look at it. This is a pretty important aspect of this alliance building that's happening in Asia. You have the AUKUS thing between the U.S., Australia. You have the Quad, which is Japan, India, Australia and the U.S. I believe the U.S. wants to bring South Korea into that. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens eventually. This is all a big part of the strategy, this new Cold War in the region. All right, the next one here, the U.S. hints at a plea deal for Julian Assange. So this is big news here. So U.S. Ambassador to Australia, Caroline Kennedy, indicated in comments to the Sydney Morning Herald that Washington might be open to a plea deal for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange that could keep him from being extradited and imprisoned in the United States for exposing U.S. war crimes. So when asked if the U.S. and Australia could reach a diplomatic solution on Assange, Kennedy, who is the daughter of President John F. Kennedy, she told the paper that it was an ongoing case being handled by the Justice Department. She said, quote, "So it's not really a diplomatic issue, but I think that there absolutely could be a resolution," end quote. So the comments come, amid this kind of new push from the Australian government that they've been pressing the Biden administration on Assange. When Blinken was in Australia, the issue was raised with him, although he rejected Australia's concerns. But still, it doesn't seem like they're dropping the issue. And Kennedy pointed to Blinken's comments, but again, she hinted that a deal could be made. She said, quote, "But there is a way to resolve it. You can read the newspapers just like I can," end quote. Not sure exactly what that means. And then when she was asked if the U.S. could reach a deal to reduce charges against Assange, she said that it's up to the Justice Department. So Gabriel Shipton, that's Assange's brother, he said that Kennedy's comments were a sign that the U.S. was thinking about resolving the issue. He said, quote, "Caroline Kennedy wouldn't be saying these things if they didn't want a way out. The Americans want this off their plate," end quote. So Assange faces up to 175 years in prison if he's extradited to the U.S. and convicted under the Espionage Act for publishing documents that he received using standard journalistic practices. So it's a huge case, horrible implications for press freedom in the U.S. and in the world. And the Sydney Morning Herald suggested that a David Hicks-style plea bargain could be on the table, referring to David Hicks, who is an Australian who was held in the notorious U.S. torture camp at Guantanamo Bay in the early 2000s. So Hicks was accused by the U.S. of providing material assistance to terrorists. So according to Consortium News, due to the pressure from the Australian government, Hicks was released after agreeing to an Alford plea, and that is a type of plea in which the defendant pleads guilty but maintains that they're innocent. So it's like pleading guilty without saying you're guilty. It's just, kind of strange sounding. But under this type of arrangement with Assange, the U.S. could downgrade the charges and take into account the 4 years that he's been locked up in London's Belmarsh prison, and Assange would serve his remaining sentence in Australia. So Dan Rothwell, he's an international law expert with the Australian National University. He told the Sydney Morning Herald that Assange would likely have to travel to the U.S., to make such a plea. But for Assange's family and legal team, going to the United States is a non-starter. They're worried that he would kill himself because of the harsh conditions of U.S. prisons. The U.S. is the country that's trying to persecute him, and they don't care about his health. They don't seem to care if he's going to die, so they have a lot of reasons why they don't want him to go there. And Consortium News spoke with a guy named Bruce Afron, who's a U.S. constitutional attorney. This was from an interview back in May that he did on their live show, the Consortium News show. And he said that it's not technically prohibited for someone to plea and not be in the country. He thinks it's possible that they could do a plea without Assange going to the U.S., and he said that a potential deal could involve Assange pleading guilty to mishandling official information, or even in the worst case scenario, conspiracy to mishandle official information, which is a far lesser charge. So that could, maybe they would only sentence him to a few years that he would then go do in Australia. And that arrangement could still set a very dangerous precedent for press freedom because it would criminalize the relationship between a journalist and a source. But of course, a much better situation than if he gets the 175 years under the Espionage Act, of course. But so this seems significant that she's saying this. She could just be, telling the Australian press what they want to hear, but I don't think so. I mean, I don't think she would be saying this if she didn't really think there was a chance of some kind of deal could be made. So I've seen, Assange activists are saying now's a good time to really kind of make a lot of noise about this. Call your representatives, tell them to support a plea deal, tell them, our relationship with Australia is, on the line here, blah, stuff like that, is a way, I think, to convince them. But hopefully this gets more and more attention, and hopefully the Australian politicians keep speaking out about it like they have been. All right, so the next one here, Niger Junta refuses to talk unless the junta is recognized. So this is from Connor Freeman. He wrote this up on Sunday. So a delegation of Nigerian Islamic scholars traveled to Niger for meetings with, Nigerian Islamic scholars, so from Nigeria. They went to Niger for meetings with the leaders of the military junta who took power last month. The group says that the coup leaders expressed an openness to diplomacy. However, this account has been sharply contradicted by a media spokesperson representing the junta, who claimed that negotiations with regional countries are impossible unless Niger's new leadership is recognized. So they're saying that they need recognition. And then the ECOWAS countries are the ones saying that they have to reinstate President Bazoum. So good news is that there has not been a military intervention yet. The defense chiefs from the ECOWAS countries were due to meet over the weekend, but the meeting was postponed. The meeting was called to review the best options for a military intervention, which ECOWAS has been threatening, and they said that they activated and ordered the deployment of a standby force to restore the constitutional order in Niger, but it doesn't look like they're going through with that. They're still leaving some room to try to work something out diplomatically. At the same time, the junta does not sound like they're going to be going anywhere, but at least for now, there's not a big intervention here because, again, this could be a disaster. And it's something the U.S. would likely back. We might launch drone strikes in support of it. I think that's certainly possible if this does go down. So far, it's not happening. But still, the coup leaders are still, very defiant. All right, so the next one here is a very interesting story. U.S. and Iranian hardliners conspired together to oust a U.S. envoy. And this is a report from Middle East Eye citing some sources. So basically what this is saying is that hardliners in Iran opposed to a return of the 2015 nuclear deal cooperated with hardliners in the United States who are also against a return to the Iran nuclear deal to oust the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Robert Malley. And this is, and again, Middle East Eye citing sources. So Malley was leading the Biden administration's effort to revive the faltering deal before he was put on administrative leave in late June. The former Obama-era official had helped craft the 2015 accord, and earlier in his career, he was involved in former President Bill Clinton's failed effort to broker peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That was at Camp David. So on June 29th, after being inactive in his role for weeks, Malley was placed on unpaid leave. He had told colleagues that he was taking extended personal leave for unspecified family reasons, but his security clearance was suspended at some point earlier this year. So these discussions to revive the Iran nuclear deal. So if you remember, there's a lot of reports that the U.S. and Iran were near a temporary or interim nuclear deal, what Netanyahu called a mini deal. There was a lot of reports, and suddenly that all kind of went away. So this report is saying just when it was reported that Iran and the U.S. were nearing a temporary deal that would swap some sanctions relief for Iran reducing its uranium enrichment, Malley disappeared. Sources in Tehran told Middle East Eye that Malley's dismissal had pleased both hardliners in Tehran and individuals in the United States, which I would also call hardliners, who are opposed to a return to the Iran nuclear deal. So a source in Tehran told Middle East Eye that certain hardline and influential elements within Iran and out of government without President Ebrahim Raisi's consent and awareness had cooperated with anti-deal circles in Washington, D.C. to fabricate information about Malley. So the source did not elaborate on the fabricated information, but referenced a report in the pro-government Tehran Times newspaper, which claimed that Malley had mishandled classified documents saying it was part of a larger plan or puzzle. So I was looking at these reports. Again, this is Tehran Times and an Iranian media site quoting U.S. sources. So it's very, very strange here. And there were several of these reports. And so the reason why I'm kind of tending to believe this report is because when Mali was first ousted, there were some rumors about him mishandling classified documents, but it kind of went away and nobody made a big stink about it. And there's some allegations in these reports that he had improper contact with Iran, with Iranian officials. So that's something Republicans would be all over, I think, if it was true. So it seems like that these things were made up to paint him in a bad light, and he's been out of his position. And it's probably because he was talking to Iran. And the allegation that they made was that he was doing it kind of secretly without, the president's knowledge or something. But that is not the case here. So hopefully there's some follow-up to this. There's also stories in the Washington Free Beacon about this as well, which is I don't know much about the Washington Free Beacon, but I know that they're really bad on Iran, super hawkish when it comes to Iran. And an informed source in Iran told Middle East Eye that this was efforts, that Mali's suspension was the result of efforts by certain Republicans. So, again, hopefully this kind of report stirs something up and we get a follow-up on it, because it definitely raises a lot of questions. But that is it for the news for today. You could go check out our viewpoints. We have one from David Stockman, The Myth of the Indispensable Nation and the Quagmire of Forever Wars. We have one from Ron Paul, As Maui Burns, Biden demands another $24 billion for Ukraine. So Biden's getting a lot of heat for looking to spend all this money on Ukraine while Hawaii is on fire. I mean, I think it's almost 100 people have been killed in these wildfires. One from Joseph Solis Mullen from the Libertarian Institute, Sanctioning China in a Taiwan Crisis, Scenarios and Risks. One from Doug Bandow, Peace Be with Afghanistan. That is over at The American Conservative. And our spotlight is from Branko Marchteach, Can Washington Pivot from its Maximalist Aims in Ukraine? That's over at Responsible Statecraft. That is it for me. Please help us out with our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Another thing, if you can't support us in that way, this is a good time to really share this show. Tell people about antiwar.com. Post our articles on social media and this video, and all that really helps out. Help expand our reach. That's another huge way you could help us out and support us. But I'll be back tomorrow. I hope everybody had a good weekend. I had a nice long weekend. I'm happy to be back. But I'll be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.